Hi there, John Paul coming to you from my home office here in Wisconsin on a -4 degree morning. So it's chilly out there. My morning walk with our dog Otis was refreshing, to say the least. We always walk out on the frozen lake, the Pigeon Lake that's right behind us during winter time. And he can just run, which is he enjoys. He's a puppy, 10-month-old Catahoula leopard puppy. All right, just a little bit of background to our readings. There's a lot for this week. Our first, when we dig into the history of European Christianity, starting with McCulloch chapter 12 on Russia, the Third Rome. A new threat to Christendom emerges, namely the Norsemen, aka the Rus, and eventually the concentration of those individuals in Kiev. The Norsemen were, of course, the Vikings, my ancestors, and they plundered their way all the way down to Constantinople from mostly from Sweden, but also Norway and Finland in 860. Through their plundering, they began trading with Byzantines, and Patriarch Photius sets up a plan to convert them, which, unlike some such plans made by various Christians, actually worked. And so by 988, Olga, a princess from Kiev, visited Constantinople and was blown away, especially by Hagia Sophia or Hagia Sophia, baptized as Yelena in a nod to the empress's wife's name. And her son, Vladimir, takes over after some inter-Rus skirmishes, and Vlad sends soldiers. By this point, they're back in Kiev, sends soldiers to prop up the claim of Basil II to the throne in Constantinople, which then gives him a say in how things are running in the Byzantine Empire. Henceforth, in 988, Vlad orders the conversion of the Rus to Christianity, and Hagia Sophia plays a key role in this process as well. And from this point on, Kiev was now enthralled by Byzantine Christian culture, McCulloch puts it. The tendency emerges over the centuries for the Rus to take particular themes from Byzantium and then develop them remorselessly, is how McCulloch puts this, and that became characteristic of Russian Orthodoxy. A couple of those key themes. The first is kenotic theology, emptying the theology, the idea that it's Christ salvation. God empties God's self for the world through Christ. And what this meant in Russian Orthodoxy, in particular, as it emerged, is that, according to McCulloch again, those who met a violent and premature end for no good reason deserve to be regarded as saints. And it's, again, put somewhat tongue-in-cheek by McCulloch, but not too far from the historical pattern. Second theme, the Western reaction to a problem is to look for a solution. McCulloch suggests the Orthodox are more inclined to live with it. And I think that pattern has been proven true over the centuries, the millennia now as well. Third theme, the role of synergy in Eastern theology. That is, this notion of cooperation with divine grace, especially through the liturgy. Augustine was never a significant theological figure in Russian Orthodoxy, as was the case in Byzantium as well. And so there's much more of an emphasis on free will and correspondingly moral accountability as a theological matter in relationship to God than in the West, so dominated in many ways by Augustinian theology of grace. Fourth theme, and this is somewhat distinctive because you don't really see this much in Byzantium, is the figure of the holy fool. And this character who teaches through unreason and who teaches through exaggerations, in some ways picking up on some of the themes in the prophets, especially Ezekiel, of course, and then also in some of the characters in the Greek and Roman philosophical tradition as well, notably the Cynics, but others as well. So the holy fool. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, is the notion of hesychasm, silence, and in particular, the hesychast prayer, the Jesus prayer, as a crucial path of personal spirituality and also of cultural solidarity, this mystical way in Russian Orthodoxy. All right, section 2 in the chapter, Tatars, Mongols. Tatars are the Mongols, Lithuania and Muscovy, 1240 to 1448, getting closer to our modern period. The Khans, who were animists moving towards Islam and actually take over Kiev and interestingly tolerate Christianity, but with limits. And what follows in the wreckage of the Khan, the Mongol pillage of Kiev and of other urban areas, is that monasteries get set up in the wreckage. And monastic life becomes a chief mark of Russian Orthodoxy down to today. Novgorod in the far north becomes a stronghold of Christianity and actually has one of the world's first republican constitutions, including space, interestingly, for dissent, something that we won't see much of throughout the rest of Russian history. Excuse me. In relation to the fall of Kiev, then Moscow takes over instead and manages to cultivate good relations with the Khans. At the same time, Vilnius, Lithuania, also takes on some significance. Again, animist traditions are significant there, but also with some Orthodox, and we'll see this tension between Lithuania, which eventually allies with Poland, and with Kiev and with Moscow as kind of a tripartite dynamic throughout history in this region. Continual, tensions between the various groups. Vilnius martyrs refuse to eat during the Christian fast and are killed by a Lithuanian king. Constantinople then calls them saints, and so you have this unity now between Constantinople and Moscow, with Lithuania and Kiev now aligned. Anyway, page 5 to 16 in McCulloch, the orthodoxy of Western Kievan Rus was steadily diverging in character from that of Muscovy and the East. And we'll see this tension playing out as we do in geopolitics today between Kiev and what is now Ukraine, pulled on the one hand to the west, and on the other hand to the east, with Moscow trying to play a crucial role in determining their destiny. A couple great paragraphs on page 518 to 519 in McCulloch. I want to share those with you. They kind of sum up a lot about Christianity in Russia. The context here is the Council of Florence, set in 1436, which fails to unify East and West, in large part due to the Russian resistance coming from Moscow. So here's McCulloch. It's the bottom of the page. Behind this political struggle of the 14th and 15th centuries, an orthodoxy was consolidated which both emphasized its roots in Byzantium and took on a distinctively local character. Rus had virtually no centers of learning or scholarship to pursue its own answers to the puzzles raised by the Christian proclamation. What it did have were complex sets of rules and conventions in worship, imported from Byzantine Christianity, the longing of ordinary folk to find ways to reach God amid the frequent harshness of their lives, and the capacity of the human imagination to range free in solitude over a spiritual inheritance. It was inevitable that a Christianity formed in the sunshine of the Mediterranean and rooted amid very obvious remains from the cultures of Greece and Rome should assume a different complexion when it was adopted in Russia. And on to the next page, 519. The emphasis of Orthodoxy on corporate life expressed in its liturgy and sacred music appealed to medieval Russian society. For here people needed to cooperate to survive at all. Individualism was not a virtue unless it was in the celebratory countercultural form exemplified by the holy fool, who could only exist because he knew which aspects of the strongly rule-bound society to overturn and mock, and thereby to reaffirm. Russian Orthodoxy was not a spirituality which valued new perspectives or original thoughts about the mysteries of faith. It looked for deepening of tradition, enrichment of the existing liturgy, enhanced insight through meditation. End quote. And as we'll see, lots of tension back and forth between the church and the various rulers of Russia at the same time. It would be remiss not to talk about the art emerging out of Russia, especially icon painting, based on the Byzantine, but adapting to uniquely Russian circumstances. And here, Andrei Rublev, who lived from 1360 to 1430, is a real model and still held up as sort of the epitome of Russian icon painting. So Muscovy triumphant, 1448 to 1547. So we're into our 16th century here. Page 522, church and court cooperated very closely in an increasingly autocratic system. We'll see this pattern over and over again, this collaboration between court and church, and sometimes the court on top, sometimes the church on top, rarely, but definitely a collaboration between the two, and certainly nothing such as the separation between church and state. It was during this period that Philofey, a monk, writes to Grand Prince Vasily, the church claiming him the Tsar, the only Tsar for Christians due to the falling of the Roman Empire under Constantine, and as the Goths came in the 5th century, falling of the Byzantines in 1453 to the Ottomans, and that left Russia as the third Rome, the title of the chapter. Certainly this became strengthened in some ways under the reign of Ivan the Terrible, although, as we'll see, ironically, a strong man sowed seeds of the crumbling of the society that he worked to build. A lifetime of exercising power through terror, McCulloch puts it on 529. He built Red Square Cathedral, the Cathedral of the Intercession in 1552, and in what is not unique in Christian architectural history, but perhaps to be lamented. He built it to celebrate 8 military victories. Poland and Lithuania forged an alliance after 1589 as a commonwealth of Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant peoples, including edicts of religious toleration. So Catholicism grows in Orthodox forms in that area, and the spirit kind of migrates to Kiev as well, and a group of individuals called Uniates, who are Orthodox in liturgy, Catholic in allegiance, emerge. Greek Catholics, and present here in the United States as well, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, a significant presence, especially in Chicago and in most major metropolitan areas. Last section of the chapter, from Muscovy to Russia. Romanov dynasty gets stabilized after the civil war that broke out because Ivan, his repression, did the patterns of society that had held Russia together. So a civil war breaks out, but the Romanov dynasty comes into place and settles things, stabilizes it, and Mikhail is the first Tsar, and his brother Filaret is the patriarch. And as McCulloch puts it well, there could hardly have been a closer union of church and throne. That's page 537. The Cossacks, who were a marauding group within the region, weren't treated well by the Poland, Lithuanian, Ukrainian Commonwealth, and so they went on a rampage. A third of the population was killed, in fact. As McCulloch puts it, this is the beginning of a long decline towards 18th century partition and oblivion, and also the beginning of a long identity crisis between East and West for the Ukrainian people. And again, we see this played out very vividly in events of our time as well. Down to the 17th and 18th centuries, Peter the Great, of course, notable figure, secularist, basically, although, nodding at least to piety. But court noted for drink and debauchery as well. And if you want to see this vividly played out in its later legacy, check out the Hulu series, The Great, about Catherine the Great, who came in as the wife of Peter's son, Peter II. Anyway, back to the church. Patriarch Adrian dies in 1700 as Peter the Great is in office, and the patriarchate remains vacant for 21 years. That gives you a little bit of an idea about what Peter thought of the church. And when it reemerged, there was a reorganization led by him, in which there was a college for spiritual affairs replacing the patriarchate, everything ruled by the Tsar, and he appointed the chief procurator for this college for spiritual affairs. But you begin to see, aligned with Enlightenment thinking, this emphasis on sort of conciliar processes. Peter introduces seminaries, but McCulloch puts it bluntly. Here they had a curriculum narrowly focusing on the theme of obedience and the selective version of Orthodox tradition which had survived the upheavals of the 17th century. Rarely in later centuries did they win much respect for their educational standards or indeed educational humanity. So the clergy become a self-perpetuating caste in Russia, according to McCulloch, and the question might well rise, how did the church endure in such a significant and pretty good quote on page 545 that may explain that. Authority and conformity were the watchwords of both the dynasty and the smallest village. But once local communities had paid their taxes to the Tsar, raised troops for his armies, and weeded out troublemakers and criminals, a lot of latitude in that latter category, they were left largely to their own devices and to their own traditions of making sense of their often desperately harsh environment. Woven inextricably into their common experiences were the practices of religion, perhaps the only area of most people's lives where it was possible to make genuine personal choices. Given the isolation of all Russians from much possibility of foreign influence apart from the tiny proportion who belonged to the elite, that meant some variant on Orthodox belief. And of course, with the Romanovs in power until 1917, and of course, that was the Russian Revolution. We'll have a chance in one of the later chapters to take a look at what happens when that dynasty crumbles and officially atheistic communism emerges. A couple last things on Russia here to take a look at. The Philokalia, the love of beauty, and I'll post a link to this on our website, really revived in the 18th century and into the 19th, the hesychastic tradition, which is still really, really strong in Russia. So take a look at that. If you're interested also in how this love of beauty plays itself out in a couple different contexts, there's a wonderful book by Mark C. Mattis, M-A-T-T-E-S. I'll put a link to this as well out there. Martin Luther's Theology of Beauty. a reappraisal in which he reads Luther in light of various aesthetic theories and theologies, mostly predating Luther, especially the European Renaissance, but also in light of discoveries about theologies of beauty elsewhere around the globe as well. No historian is ever purely objective or just writing about the past. We're always also talking about the present and the future. And then finally, within Catholic tradition, Hans Urs von Balthasar, 20th century Swiss Catholic theologian, has written 7 beautiful volumes on beauty, entitled The Glory of the Lord. And I will be happy to put a link to Balthasar's works as well, in case you are interested on following up on that as a thread or a theme for your final project. All right, McCulloch chapter 16. I think we can move more quickly. We're probably on more familiar ground to many of you. Years 1300 to 1500. So these are, preludes to the Reformation, and in many ways precursors of the Reformations. So by 1300, the Church, Death, and Purgatory is the section here under the topic of the chapter, Perspectives on the True Church. The church is pretty stable in 1300. Within its own world, McCulloch says, the church was united by institutions whose ultimate appeal was to Rome. Now, this is Europe, not Byzantium. Canon law, religious orders, indeed the whole network of parishes, dioceses, and archdioceses, which made a honeycomb of the map of Europe. Universities, too, owed themselves to papal grants for the most part, and of course, the common scholarly language of Latin pulled together these various facets of life. There were rivals in different monarchs and in different empires, smaller empires, kingdoms, but none with the universal reach across Europe of the Roman Catholic Church. The Black Death, 1348 to 53, so many analogies to what we are living through these days without, of course, scientific understanding of its causes, which means that in this time period, scapegoats were sought out, and especially anti-Semitic outbreaks occurred, the most severe persecution of Jews before the 20th century. McCulloch puts it, certainly an ugly part of church history that, alas, has recurred. Yesterday was Yom HaShoah, the day of Holocaust remembrance. Related theme, maybe not. See what you think about this. Shrines around relics of Christ's blood spring up during this time period. And if you're interested, I'll post a link to this on the website as well. One of these shrines that I visited is the Basilica of the Holy Blood in Bruges. It's a stunning building and a fascinating history there too. So what do we do with this fascination with blood, the sanguinary thread in the history of Christianity? Certainly an important one on many levels. You have both the purity taboos associated with menstruation on the one hand, but then this fascination with Christ's blood, both in relics and, of course, in Eucharist. McCulloch puts it this way on page 555. European society in the wake of the Black Death remained preoccupied by death and what to do about it. No wonder the 11th and 12th century development of the doctrine of purgatory was one of the most successful and long-lasting theological ideas in the Western Church. So, purgatory, coming out of the Black Death, emerges as highly popular because it suggests that there was something constructive to be done for the dead. This is an empathetic understanding of the doctrine of purgatory, first of all, and then of the practice of indulgences, about which McCulloch says indulgences were as ubiquitous as the modern lottery ticket. So if heaven as a reality has been transferred, as Carl Becker thought, into the notion of progress, and especially economic progress, see his book, The Heavenly City of the 18th Century Philosophers, indulgences, lottery tickets, not too far off, with some theological tweaks necessary. McCulloch also traces nicely, I think, a difference between the Christian North and the Christian South within Europe, with the North more beholden to the indulgence system and to the doctrine of purgatory and the practices of penance, with the South more laissez-faire. And again, we may trace some of that difference to climate, if you would, but also to the relative influence of Augustinianism in the North and a more cooperative semi-Pelagian or Pelagian theology in the South. So, papal monarchy challenged, the second section of this chapter. Note the emergence of language about the Pope as the Antichrist. Luther wasn't the first, although he certainly made use of that invective. But first of all, it came from monarchs, imperial aspirants on the one hand, but then within the church, the spiritual Franciscans also identified the Pope with these terms. And so this criticism of especially papal wealth and coming out of the Renaissance, the Borgias, about whom we'll say a little bit more, and others, there was room for critique, for both for moral behavior and in terms of greed and ostentation. So the papacy is in flux during these years as well, including the flight of the Pope to Avignon in France, and at one point there were 4 different aspirants to the see of Peter. This all was resolved by 1446, after which the Pope was always in Rome down to today. The rebuild of St. Peter's takes place, and the Renaissance splendor really takes off under the Borgias, and especially Alexander VI, who birthed several children, ostensibly celibate, and Julius II, who is a warrior general, warrior pope, who takes Bologna in a military campaign. So you can see why there would be reason for critique on both moral and material grounds. Third section of the chapter, nominalists, Lollards, and Hussites. Nominalism is a school of philosophy associated especially with William of Ockham, which focuses on not confusing names for realities. So a tree is not the same thing as all trees. So Occam's razor basically means, cut to the simplest possible explanation. A tree is a tree, not tree. And so this is a development that opens up the possibility of critiquing, especially some of the Aristotelian and, through Augustine, the Platonic overlays of Christian theology, and really develops what is called the Via Moderna. This emphasis on theology in critical capacity. One exception to this sort of critique, very clearly, nominalists such as Occam and Luther, in his early understanding, and the earliest influences on Luther were the nominalists. Humans have a role in salvation. And the way this works is that God's mercy ascribes value to human worth, to human merit. A neat way to put this is that grace, God's grace, fulfills nature. That is, takes nature and brings it to its happy realization in the fashion with which God intended it. Now, obviously, this is not, again, Augustinian theology with his deep pessimism about the human will, and, of course, Augustine's arguments with Pelagius about free will. We could happily discuss those. If you have questions about any of this stuff, send them to me in an email, or respond to this video with your questions. So the Devotio Moderna, the modern way, the Via Moderna, especially emphasizes moral righteousness. And what this means is that the preeminent vehicle of grace, namely Jesus, becomes the moral exemplar. And here, Thomas à Kempis's famous devotional treatise, The Imitation of Christ, is the key work, still well worth reading. The Lollards, a group associated with John Wycliffe, who was an Oxford Don, and developed a conception of the universal church. He was not a nominalist, which contrasted the universal true church with the visible false church. Luther also makes strong use of this distinction. And in place of the church's authority, Wycliffe urged people to turn to the Bible. And either one of those matters could have gotten him in serious trouble, but the third one got him in even more trouble. Wycliffe, according to MacCulloch, loathed not merely transubstantiation, but the whole notion of divine bodily presence in bread and wine. He regarded the doctrine as a clerical deception. Needless to say, these opinions plunged Oxford into debate, but Wycliffe had some protectors and was an Oxford Don. He died in 1384, protected by a few nobles at a country estate, but his bones were dug up a few decades later to burn them for heresy. Wycliffe's followers became known as the Lollards, which is a term of, it's a derogatory term, mumblers who talk no sense, lollard, 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 lollard. Wycliffe's followers then have had the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, which was the Bible, translated into English for the first time. It was banned, but vernacular translations began multiplying in Germany, Spanish, Dutch, etc. And according to many historians, this may have created the Reformation rather than being created by it. Along with that, the printing press, of course, emerging, and some historians have gone so far as to say the Reformation really was the reading Reformation. Literacy numbers are hard to know exactly, but anywhere in 1500, maybe between 1 and 10% of men could read. Far fewer could read Latin. Maybe 10% could read their vernacular. By 1680, and for this we have some pretty clear documentation from a number of different places, 70% of men and women could read in the vernacular. And I can pass those sources along to you if you'd be interested. It's in a talk I gave a couple of years ago. The Hussites, then in Bohemia, a third sort of anticipation of the Reformation. Anne of Bohemia marries English King Richard II in 1382, and a preacher by the name of Jan Hus reads Wycliffe. So, Bohemia and England have, some trade back and forth. And then Hus starts preaching fiery sermons attacking the church on behalf of the nobility. He becomes rector of the university in 1412, at which point he is excommunicated. If not only because of his preaching, but because he made a change in the liturgy. He began offering wine as well as bread to the laity. That is, offering communion in both kinds. And this becomes a significant sign of independence from Rome as the Reformation takes off. Huss travels to the Council of Constance in 1415, supposedly under the aegis of the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, who had given him a promise of safe conduct. Sigismund is persuaded to betray that promise, and Huss dies, burned at the stake, Czech martyr. The Eucharist then in Bohemia becomes a symbol of the revolution. And there's continuous warfare between different sides, basically focused around the Eucharist. And this offering of communion in two kinds becomes, from the ground up, a change and what McCulloch calls a slow decentralization of the church from below. Eventually, the radical Hussites, and there were a couple different groups of them too, become the Union of Bohemian Brethren, the Unitas Fratrum, who take positions not only on behalf of communion in two kinds, but also against war, against capital punishment, and against the taking of oaths. They have no separate priesthood and obviously no doctrine of transubstantiation as well. We would know them now as the Moravian Brethren, up in whose seminary, of course, is up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. According to McCulloch, Bohemia became the first part of Latin Europe to slip out of its medieval papal obedience, and I believe that is an accurate statement as well. Old worlds bring new, humanism, 1300 to 1500. You could say that these are the sections that McCulloch finds most interesting and important, both the growth of humanism, through Ciceronic rhetoric, mysticism through the Corpus Hermeticum and the Jewish Kabbalah. But really what unites the humanist movement from 1300 to 1500 is this call ad fontes, to the sources. And so incredible revival of classical learning, obviously Plato, or more Plato than Aristotle now, although of course Aristotle still becomes or is still the philosopher of the church because of the influence of Thomas Aquinas. But you begin to see the study of the Bible in Hebrew and Greek, not just in Latin. As McCulloch puts it, as people begin reading the Bible in Hebrew and Greek, they realized the Western Church was not so authoritative an interpreter of Scripture as it claimed. Page 582, similarly important point. Previously, congregations in the West as in the East would have experienced the Bible primarily as performance. Now, the humanist perception of the Bible as a text written and then to be read like any other book began to place a question mark around a great deal of venerable tradition, end quote. So that's humanism in a nutshell. Reforming the church in the last days, 1500, is kind of a weird section, actually focused mostly on Spain, though, and Spain becomes increasingly important in the Catholic world, marked especially by two big directions. The attacks on Jews and Muslims, forced conversions of Jews and Muslims under the control of the new Inquisition with Thomas de Torquemada as Inquisitor General. Spain's fascinating, and I'll post one of my sermons from last year in which I preach about Teresa of Avila, who was herself a reformer, but very much in a vein different than Martin Luther. And so it's easy to focus on the Inquisition, thank you, Monty Python, and to miss how in Spain, during these years, many of the structural abuses that were real start getting addressed. Even before the Society of Jesus takes off, with Ignatius Loyola, and the formal Reformation gets underway. And so there's a good paragraph on page 590 in McCulloch that speaks to this. The Spanish version of Catholicism thus presents a complex set of features. It fostered deep personal yearnings for closeness to God, linked to mystical spirituality in Judaism and Islam, and later bearing rich fruit in the mystical experience of Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. Alongside official and unofficial moves to remove corruption from church institutions, churchmen revealed a paranoid suspicion of any rival culture, which found increasing support from the secular authorities. After official Spain decisively rejected the peninsula's multicultural past, it is not unfair to see subsequent Spanish Christianity as a major exponent and practitioner of ethnic cleansing. Much of Europe, McCulloch puts it, was in high excitement about the future, ranging in expression from decorous humanist editing of Hermetic and Kabbalistic texts to prophecies from wild-eyed women in Spanish or Italian villages and angry sermons of respected clergy. So 1500 comes and goes. Erasmus, clearly, McCulloch, as a humanist scholar himself, loves Erasmus, as do I. If you've never read anything by Erasmus, I would encourage you to start with The Praise of Folly. It's an amazing work, dripping with irony and dripping with critique of European culture, the nobles, the church, and especially average people. Erasmus was a humanist, knew, 7, 8 languages, could converse in all of them, and truly was, as McCulloch puts it, the patron saint of networking, because he would travel to England to hang out with Thomas More, and then travel down to Italy, and had his roots in the Netherlands, would go to Belgium, Germany, etc. I mean, really was all over. Had a long-running debate with Martin Luther, several volumes on the question of the freedom of the will, with Erasmus more or less for, Luther against. Although those are characters of their position, they both understood the important relationship between grace and works, and published a Greek New Testament in 1516, and was a pacifist as well. So if you're interested in following up more on this important humanist and theologian, check out The Praise of Folly and his Enchiridion, his basically Catechism for the Christian Soldier, which with soldier understood here far more metaphorically than literally. I'll do a separate, much shorter video on Barbara McAfee, her story. Want to give that its due, but wanted to give you a little bit of a hint about what you will find in McCulloch 15 and 16 as we set the stage to move into the Reformations next week. Happy reading.